Hello everyone, welcome back to Zeedup Technologies. In our previous session, we had seen what is S3, how do you create a bucket, and what are the different properties of S3. We had covered essentially all the properties that is required while creating the S3 bucket. Today we shall be in general learning about a little bit detailed version of S3 and what do you exactly mean by the objects that you can upload in S3. We will see the properties tab, we will also see the permissions, matrix, management and access point. To start with, we shall be looking into a little bit detailed about objects today. As you can see right now, I do not have anything inside my bucket, but I can upload, as we had seen in our previous session, I can upload any kind of document, HTML file, a picture, or any other content in this bucket, which will be referred as objects. Similarly, there is something called as properties. In properties, this is a very important aspect of AWS. Properties has a lot of gist about the bucket that we have just created. It tells you in detail the things that you can change or not change about the bucket. For example, bucket overview. As you can see, this bucket was hosted in US East, Ohio, as in our previous session. Bucket versioning, as I had already mentioned, bucket versioning is nothing but keeping multiple versions of the same content inside a bucket. So you can think of a duplicate entry if that is going to be allowed in the bucket or no, and that is what bucket versioning means. If you see, we do have an edit option over here, so I can suspend the creation of the object versions for the operations, meaning right now it is enabled. I can upload two same documents in this bucket, but if I suspend it, I will no longer be able to do it. Similarly, there's an option called multi-factor authentication. As I have already mentioned, this is nothing but an elaborative security measure provided by AWS on all different resources. Right now we are using S3, and that is why we are going through multi-factor authentication over here. But you do have this option in a lot of more places. Now, inside properties, we will go on to tags. If you remember, we had created a tag storing data during while creating this bucket, which comes very handy when we have to do the billing and the costing of each and every S3 bucket. So how do we recognize if each and every bucket and what costing is every bucket actually billing us? So in that case, we use tags over here. Similarly, there is something called as default encryption. This is also something that we had set up while creating the bucket itself, so we need not go in detail this time. Next is intelligent tiering archive configuration. I'm going to click and show you all what do you exactly mean by this configuration. You can name this configuration anything. The configuration name can contain 64 alphanumeric characters, so we are just going to name it ABC for now. Choose a configuration scope. So each these two options are essentially to let us know that if the configuration applies to all the objects in the bucket, or is it going to be limited to a certain number of objects. How do you go about limiting this configuration is, if you see here, add a filter to limit the scope. So enter a prefix. All the objects that I upload into this bucket, if it has the prefix of Zeedup, meaning this will automatically get covered under this archive configuration settings, and this will the object the all the configuration that I'm going to do right now over here will get covered in that. So this is what you mean by adding archive configuration settings. Next is something called as object tag. If you intend to go with each and every object tagging, you want a detailed summary of how many type and how many times an object has been cached, how many times an object has been accessed, how many times using any data point is the object being retrieved. All of that you can do by adding a tag over here. Next is status of whether the configuration will be enabled or disabled. You always have the option of disabling this configuration. For example, if the configuration did not work for us in month 1, we can observe, and in the month 2 we can take an action and disable this configuration, or we can also add a new configuration if required. Archive settings. Intelligent tiring can tire down objects to archive access. The deep archive access tier, or both. The number of days until the transition to the selected tiers can be extended to up to a total of 2 years. So if you see, this is an archived access tier and deep archived access tier. The difference, as I had already mentioned, this is the S3 Glacier, what they are elaborating over here. As I had already mentioned, the archive access tier is mainly for 90 days and the deep archive tier is for 180 days. So you can create this. Right now I'm not going to choose to create any such configuration because we need to be more elaborative about this. So we have seen how we can set up or create a configuration for a single bucket, and what all are the individual fields that are required to be able to cover inside this bucket. Next is server access login. Server access login is right now disabled for me. As I had already mentioned, we do have an option to enable or disable it. Server access log is nothing but the log requests to access this bucket, meaning every time this bucket is accessed, if something goes wrong with this bucket, if there is an error log or an access log, both of that gets covered inside this. That is what we mean by server access logging. Next is AWS Cloud Trial data events. We shall be looking into Cloud Trial in a little bit more detailed manner, because this has got a little bit to do about monitoring our AWS. So you can go ahead and configure, but this is a completely separate module called Cloud Trial. I shall be covering this in depth later. I can also configure event notifications, so I can create an event if I intend to, if I have a prefix, I can set up a prefix, I can also set up a suffix with every object that I want to create an event on. I can get notifications based on this event. So if you want a put, post, or copy operation on that particular object, if you want permanently deleted or only marked deleted. So all these are different options that we cannot ignore while we are setting up the event notification. The destination can be an SNS topic, can be a Lambda function. If there is a Lambda function, it will ask us to choose the Lambda function right over here. So this is what is about the event notifications. Next is transfer acceleration. It is a very, very important aspect of S3. This can help us in improving S3's performance. If your S3 bucket is not in the same region, it is very likely possible that it can give you problems in terms of its performance, and that is when transfer acceleration comes into the picture. In the transfer acceleration, right now it is disabled. You can also enable it. Please note that to be able to improve your S3 performance, this is a little bit chargeable. It is charged based on if it is enabled or disabled on each bucket. So S3 bucket charges are standard, but transfer acceleration charges are on the top. So if your S3 bucket charges has been $20, depending on how much data has been accessed from it, what GB of data are you already storing in it, how much requests were back and forth between your application and your S3, depends on this costing of transfer acceleration. But yes, when it comes to S3 performance, is it does make a lot of difference in the S3 bucket. But although if you are looking for a very efficient or a cost optimized option, this might not be the best way. Although putting the S3, as I have already mentioned it multiple number of times, putting the S3 in the same bucket, in the same region as your EC2 or any other data center server is always a good practice and is always suggested to do it like that. Next is object log. Object log is nothing but if you can write it multiple number of times, or you can only read from the object. That's the only option that can be set from here. It varies based on each and every bucket, but yes, for this bucket right now it is disabled for us. Next is requester pays. When enabled, the requester pays for requests and data transfer cost, and anonymous access to this bucket is disabled. So requester pays is nothing but, as already mentioned, it is for the pays for the request and the data transfer cost that you can access or that you will be using from this bucket. Static website hosting, very very important option. If you want S3 to be able to generate a URL for you for public access, S3 doesn't give you that inbuilt. So you can define the bucket that you are going to be hosting this bucket as a static website hosting. So this is very important option whenever you want to host an entire website. Right now I do not have any such intentions, and hence I'm not going to do that. Next is permissions. Permissions, as we have already seen, more or less blocking the bucket settings. Bucket policy, very important setting where you can define the ACLs that we were learning in the last session. ACLs come into picture and no policy to display. If you have any policy, you can put the policy here. And object ownership, object writer will be the owner, and the different ACLs that we had done in the last session. Cross origin resource sharing is something that we had covered in the last session, where if AWS allows another bucket from another region to be able to access this objects in this bucket or no. That is what it means. Matrix is, for example, the total bucket size and the total number of objects. AWS displays some brilliant matrix for end users. This comes very handy whenever we are trying to save costs or going to analyze or monitor what exactly went wrong over here if our billing is not under our budget. Management is nothing but life cycle rule. For the life cycle rule, what do we mean by a life cycle rule in AWS? So to manage your objects so that they are stored cost effectively throughout their life cycle, configure their Amazon S3 lifecycle. And S3 lifecycle configuration is a set of rules that defines action that S3 applies to the age to a group of objects. So there can be two types of objects. Transition actions, that is when an object is transitioned from one storage class to another storage class. Next is expiration access, where you define the objects when the objects can expire. So that is what we mean by life cycle here. We shall be creating a life cycle rule here. You can define the rule name here. You can choose a rule scope if you have any. Again, the same thing that we had done in the previous configuration settings. You can define the prefix, and then there are some lifecycle rules. Transition current version of objects between storage class. Transition previous version of objects between storage class. Expire current version of objects. Permanently delete previous versions of objects. So this comes in hand when we have to set up any lifecycle rules based on each and every object that is currently being set in the bucket. Next is, we will go in the management session. Next is replication rule. AWS, as I had already mentioned earlier, comes with a host of replication rules. Why are these rules important? Because S3 can be hosted and given an option of multi availability zone. This is something that we had already talked about. This is nothing but in multiple zones, you want your S3 bucket to be active and to be able to prevent data loss. That is how it works.